Fermentation might be the oldest concept in human history, and today we're going to talk about why. Before the first city, before the first road, before people decided to stay in one place long enough to call it home, fermentation existed. Why the hell has alcohol been so important to being human? It speaks to our organic natural ingenuity. Leave the right liquid in the right conditions for the right amount of time, and something magical develops that's going to be safer than water, more robust and nutritious than grain alone. History suggests that fermentation, its history, and the rituals around it might be the thing that caused us to settle, to form groups, and to form identities. Everything in your glass is older than you think. Today, we are going all the way back to the beginning. Behaviors traveled with human migration. History teaches us a sequence. Agriculture leads to surplus, leads to fermentation, leads to civilization. That ancient instinct, that innate knowledge, it's sitting in every single glass of alcoholic beverage that you've ever enjoyed. Nobody invented fermentation. There was no light bulb moment. No single day when somebody figured it out. It didn't work like that. Fermentation is a natural process. It was happening in the world long before humans even got here. Fruit falls off a tree, splits open on the warm ground. Sugars inside begin to change when it hits the oxygen. It wasn't because they understood why. It was because they watched what happened when they consumed one versus the other. Fermentation produces alcohol. It also produces acidity. It creates a living environment that pathogens struggle to survive in. The same process that gives our beer character and gives our wine structure was, for most of human history, a water purification system. Beer rations in ancient Egypt were not considered a luxury. Workers building monuments, soldiers moving through hostile terrain, laborers in the heat. They received beer as a part of their daily ration because it was caloric, it was sustaining, and it was a lot safer than whatever natural water source was nearby. Public health infrastructure started in a clay pot full of beer. When I'm talking about how fermentation shaped civilization, I'm not being poetic. I'm just telling you the story where it starts. Fermented beverages may have been the thing that allowed large amounts of people to live around each other without dying from the water that they shared. When we say fermentation, what do we actually mean? Here's the short answer. Yeast is eating sugar and producing two things: alcohol, carbon dioxide. That is fermentation in a sentence. The short answer does not prepare you for what it actually looks like when it's happening. Around hour 36 of an active fermentation, the liquid is alive in a way that's generally startling the first time you witness it. It moves without being stirred. It generates heat. The CO2 that rises through it makes a sound. It's a low, rhythmic pulse. The smell coming off the top of that vessel is simultaneously sweet, yeasty, and faintly acidic. It's like bread rising in a warm oven, but more alive and more wild. Billions of yeast organisms reproduce at a rate fast enough to raise the temperature of hundreds of gallons of liquid. That yeast is freaky. I didn't know yeast was freaky. That activity is where flavor is actually born. The sugars that are being consumed, the rate of consumption, the temperature of the environment, and the specific character of the yeast doing the consuming. Every single one of these variables is writing information into the liquid that no amount of distillation could ever fully erase. You can refine what fermentation produces, but you cannot undo what it decides. This brings us to the most important decision when fermenting. This is the one that nobody talks about, but everybody who's had a sip of beer knows about. It isn't the barrel, it isn't the still, it isn't the aging warehouse. Before any of that, someone chose what organism is going to do the fermenting. The choice and strain of yeast shapes everything that happens afterward. There's two broad approaches to choosing a yeast style when fermenting. The first is cultivated yeast, a specific strain that is isolated and propagated because it's going to behave in a predictable fashion and have specific flavor compounds when it's produced, pretty much every time. This is the dominant approach to commercial and large-scale production of fermented beverages. This gives consistency and control. It gives you the ability to produce the same character batch after batch. The second approach is wild fermentation. No pitched yeast. The vessel is left open. Before there were rules or anybody keeping track of anything, there was a liquid inside of a container. It was changing on its own, becoming something different over time. And it was doing something that nobody fully understood. But guess what? They drank it anyway. This was not because people were reckless. It's because they had watched this process long enough to know that what came out of that container was safer than the water that went in. Wild yeast, tiny organisms, trillions of them floating in the air around us, land on that fruit, and the transformation begins all on its own. What humans invented was noticing, watching, remembering, and repeating on purpose. Alcohol is by no means new. It's older than history, and for many historians, the human story, towns, laws, writing, civilization itself, begins right alongside the story of fermented beverages. Some people might say civilization as we know it happened because of fermented beverages. We have ancient pottery stained on the inside by the remnants of the chemical reaction of alcohol. These vessels came from first Africa, across Asia, across the ancient world. The same discovery made independently by people who never met each other, living thousands of years apart, seemed to have this crazy connection of alchemy. This tells you something. No one civilization can truly take credit for alcohol's invention. It was an outgrowth of simply being human. Humans, whenever science is telling you the truth, began in Africa. Egypt invented straws specifically to drink the thick and cloudy beers made in northern Africa. West Africa had sorghum beers. It was woven into medicine, into ceremony, and it was long before anybody was documenting anything. This knowledge traveled with people as they moved. By the time anybody had written any of it down, fermentation was already ancient. It wasn't about just making a pleasant drink. Nobody knew why, but they did notice something. Mix wine into this suspicious water, wait about half an hour, water stops making people sick. Even 5,000 years ago, this was understood. It wasn't through science, it was simply through watching. Alcohol in fermented beverages, the acidity it produces creates an environment that pathogens can't survive in. It was water purification and a system that nobody had named yet. Biblical times, we all know the story. That water that was mixed with wine, it wasn't just to keep the party going. It was so folks could survive. Beer rations were a part of the daily wage in Egypt. Fermented beverages were caloric, and they were reliably safer than the shared water supply. The workers building those ever-famous monuments, the pyramids, were kept alive with beer. It didn't just produce a drink. Fermentation made it possible for large amounts of people to live close together without dying from the water they shared. What is fermentation? Here's what it is. Yeast is hanging out all around us. Yeast finds sugar. It poops out bubbly alcohol and carbon dioxide. In beer, the brewer holds on to the carbon dioxide. That's where the bubbles come from. In wine, the CO2 escapes into the air. Same process, different decisions about what to keep. After about 36 hours of fermentation, the liquid in the vessel starts moving on its own. It starts creating heat. Billions of organisms are eating and reproducing fast enough to generate a vessel that is warm to the touch. It smells like bread rising in a warm kitchen, but a little more wild. There's fruit underneath it. There's a faint sharpness, something unmistakably alive. The surface pulses, and if you put your hand near the top of the vessel, you can just feel that warmth rising. Think about bourbon, single malt scotch, tequila. Before the barrel, before the still, before any decision that we romanticize about with great drinks, somebody made a choice about the yeast. That choice shaped everything that happened afterwards. There's two approaches, cultivated yeast and wild yeast. Cultivated yeast, a brewer selects a specific strain that's isolated for reliable and predictable flavor and behavior. Same result batch after batch. Wild fermentation. No yeast is added. They just leave the vessel open and let the atmosphere do its job. Whatever's living in the air, whatever's on the fruit skins, whatever's on the walls of the room, that does the work. It's less predictable. It carries real risk if you don't know what the hell you're doing. It also produces flavors that cultivated yeast will never be able to replicate. The flavors are site-specific. They're microbial fingerprint of a particular place at a particular time. That's the root of what people mean by the word terroir. Terroir goes deeper than the soil. It starts right in the air with that whatever organism touches the liquid first. A serious distiller is going to first ask about the quality of the yeast. Everything built afterward sits on top of what fermentation decides. Yeast is like the honey badger. It does not care what sugar it eats. It only cares that sugar's there. What that sugar came from is where every drink begins to separate itself from every other. Grapes carry their own sugar and carry wild yeast right on the skin. Crush them and the fermentation wants to start on its own almost immediately. Wine ferments so naturally that a man named Thomas Brad Welch spent years figuring out how to stop it from happening. His company is still working on the same problem, and whenever I'm sad and having a bad day, I drink Welch's grape juice with 2 hands. Grain don't give up sugar as easily. It has to be malted, soaked in water, mashed, and heated until the starches break down into something that yeast can consume. That process alone is already writing flavor into what becomes beer, or eventually whiskey. That's right, the whiskey that you like, it starts as a beer. Sugarcane ferments into something that carries green, tropical character of the cane fields into the liquid. You'll taste it decades later in a finished rum agricole. Agave stores up sugar for up to 12 years in a dense core. When that core gets roasted in a deep pit with smoke and hot rocks, that fermented juice carries something ancient and mineral that nothing else produces. It's called pulque. That's mezcal before mezcal becomes mezcal. Honey ferments into mead, or a beverage called tej that's existed in Ethiopia for over 7,000 years. This process is universal. It belongs to every single human. The liquid that comes out of fermentation has a name before it becomes anything else. If it's a wash, if it's from fruit, it's a must. At this point, it sits between 5 and 15% alcohol. If you want to stop here, you already have a finished beverage. So let's talk about what happens when you do. Beer is the grain wash left to be exactly what it is. The process starts with malting. Barley is soaked in water and allowed to begin sprouting. Then it's dried with heat. That sprouting activates the enzymes inside the grain that will later break down starches into sugar. The liquid that you drain off, it's sweet, it's warm, and it smells like oatmeal and caramel. It's called wort. The wort gets boiled. And here is where the hops enter. Hops are little flowers, specifically the cone-shaped flowers of the Apellis plant. They're resinous, they're aromatic, and they're bitter. They got bud structure. When they're added to a boiling wort, they do 2 things. They balance the sweetness of the malt with bitterness. They also act as a natural preservative. The same instinct that led ancient brewers to add the tree bark and flowers to their vessels to keep the liquid from. So, when they were in India, they found these beautiful resinous buds. They added them to the beer, and that made the beer able to survive the voyage. After the boil, the wort cools off and yeast is pitched in. Fermentation begins. What comes out on the other side is beer. There are 3 variables that decide how beer is going to taste. Hops, yeast. Malt brings sweetness, body, color. A pale malt produces a light golden beer with a gentle sweetness. Roasted malt, it's pushed further with heat until it gets dark and caramelized, gets chocolate, coffee, smoke. This is why a stout is dark and bitter and a pilsner is pale and crisp. Same process, different malt decisions. This is also why Guinness is much lighter than Blue Moon. It's a fact. Not lighter in color, but taste the 2 and that Blue Moon is going to sit a lot heavier on your palate. Hops bring bitterness and aroma. A beer brewed with hops added early to the boil will be bitter with little floral character. A beer brewed with hops added at the very end or after fermentation is a process called dry hopping. This is going to be explosively aromatic. Citrus, pine, tropical fruit, and grass, all of them are going to come from the same plant added at a different moment. All right, so there's 3 variables that are going to affect the taste of the beer besides the cereal grains that are used. Malt, hops, yeast. Malt is going to bring sweetness and body. A pale malt is going to give you a golden light beer with a gentle sweetness. A roasted malt that's been heated and pushed further is going to give chocolate, coffee, and notes of smoke. This is why a stout is going to be dark and bitter. A pilsner is going to be pale and crisp. This is also why if you taste Guinness and Blue Moon against each other, the Guinness is going to taste lighter. And it doesn't have to be the nitro version, all you beer nerds. A Belgian triple is going to be lighter than a nitro milk stout. Hops bring bitterness and aroma. A beer brewed with hops added early to the boil will be bitter with little floral character. A beer brewed with hops added at the end in a technique called dry hopping is going to be explosively aromatic, citrus notes, pine notes, tropical fruit, grass. It's all coming from the same plant, just added at a different moment. Yeast brings everything else. Ale yeast works warm and fast and produces fruity, complex flavors. The banana and clove in a German Hefeweizen comes entirely from the yeast, not from any banana or clove in the recipe. Lager yeast works cold and slow and produces a clean, crisp character with almost no yeast-derived flavor at all. Ale versus lager are going to be the two categories at the beginning of the beer definition that determine a lot. Malt, hops, yeast.